The Second World War was the most destructive conflict in human history. It not only took the lives of millions of people and destroyed countless cities, it also destroyed the unique and remarkable multi-ethnic patchwork of Eastern and Central Europe and replaced it with mono-ethnic states. This process can be examined best with the example of Lviv, Lwów or Lemberg, a city in modern-day western Ukraine which had been part of the Galician-Volhynian Principality, the Polish Kingdom, the Habsburg Empire and the Second Polish Republic. It became the victim of both Soviet and German aggression, and its inhabitants deeply suffered under it. The case of Lviv also shows how ethnic conflicts could turn into outright violence under an oppressive regime. Just before the war, Polish Lwów had a population of more than 300,000. Roughly half of them were ethnic Poles, a third were Jews, and around 15% were ethnic Ukrainians. They had gotten along reasonably well for centuries and proudly shared a common identity as inhabitants of this unique Central European city. Of course, there were still ethnic conflicts, as I've shown in my previous video about Lwów during the interwar period. The brutal war that broke out between Ukrainians and Poles after the collapse of the Habsburg monarchy in 1918 and the pogrom in the city's Jewish quarters carried out by Polish soldiers greatly affected the relations between the three groups. The Polish state then attempted to emphasize the Polish character and past of the city, and huge public celebrations were organized each year to remember the Battle of Lwów. At the same time, discriminatory laws were introduced against the Ukrainian minority in an attempt to assimilate them into Polish culture. Many Ukrainian schools were closed or turned into bilingual schools, and most Ukrainian university professors were replaced by ethnic Poles. The Jews were often seen as internal enemies and subjected to anti-Semitic tirades and attacks. In the 1930s, the founding of Ukrainian terrorist organizations made a rapprochement between Ukrainian nationalists and the Polish state almost impossible. As Poland suffered from economic hardships and became increasingly authoritarian after the death of Józef Piłsudski, ethnic tensions rose further. Still, daily life in Lwów was not dominated by ethnic feuds. Mixed marriages were a common phenomenon, politics were just a secondary matter, people shared a common identity as inhabitants of Lwów, and everyone enjoyed the city's unique cultural life. The 1st of September 1939, the day of the German invasion of Poland, marked the beginning of the end of the cosmopolitan and multi-ethnic city of Lwów. The Wehrmacht advanced at a rapid pace, and already on the 12th of September they reached Lwów and began shelling it relentlessly with artillery. Mere days later, the water and gas supply collapsed and the power went out. Around 800 people died every day as a result of the bombardment. The Polish army was already putting up a tough but ultimately hopeless fight against a superior enemy with no foreign assistance when suddenly, on the 17th of September, the Soviets invaded from the east. Just like the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany had agreed to in a secret supplementary protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact shortly before the outbreak of the war, both Lwów and the whole of eastern Poland fell under the Soviet sphere of influence. On the 21st of September, the Red Army reached the city and the local Polish commander, Władysław Langner, decided to capitulate to them. Initially, the Soviet takeover went smoothly, without much resistance from the local population, and the Red Army treated the inhabitants relatively well. The reactions among the people were very mixed, especially communists, and some workers enthusiastically cheered for the Soviets, and so did a big number of Jews and Ukrainians who hoped that the discriminatory policies the Polish state had introduced would finally be abolished. Compared to the German Nazis, Soviet rule was also seen as the lesser evil. But most inhabitants worried about the future, and they were unsure about how they would live their lives from now on. Just a very quick side note, because the city will be changing hands quite often during this episode, I will only refer to it by its contemporary name, Lviv, from now on for the sake of simplicity. On the 22nd of October, a rigged election for the National Assembly of Western Ukraine was held, in which the pro-Soviet candidates, very surprisingly, won. Shortly after, Lviv, alongside all of Eastern Galicia, was incorporated into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Very quickly, the Soviet system of government was introduced. The industry was nationalized and large land estates were confiscated and redistributed. In the first few months of their rule, the Soviets wished to be perceived as liberators of the local Ukrainians from the yoke of the Polish bourgeoisie, and so they initiated a short period of Ukrainization. For example, Jan Kazimierz University was renamed to Ivan Franko University after the famous Ukrainian writer, and many Ukrainian scholars were promoted to higher positions. All of the university's discriminatory policies, such as the one which forced the Jews to sit on so-called ghetto benches at the very back of the lecture halls, were also promptly abolished, so that the number of Jewish and Ukrainian students significantly increased. The Shevchenko Society, the oldest Ukrainian scientific society, was disbanded, but its members were instead given employment in the new local branches of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, with its headquarters in Kyiv. And so institutes for the history of Ukraine, Ukrainian literature, linguistics, Ukrainian folklore studies, archaeology and economy were set up in Lviv. Most Polish cultural and scientific institutions, including the hugely symbolic and important Ossolineum, a Polish national institute and library, were put under the Academy's control. The Opera House, arguably the most famous centre of Polish culture during the times of the partition, was nationalised by the Ukrainian SSR and elevated to the rank of Ukrainian state theatre. All over Eastern Galicia, the number of schools in Polish language was drastically reduced from almost 5,000 to less than 1,000, while the number of Ukrainian schools rose from around 370 to more than 5,000. Polish still remained the most commonly spoken language in Lviv, but Ukrainian became much more commonly heard, and most Ukrainians confidently spoke it in public. But Ukrainization never went further than that, and the Soviet claim that Eastern Galicia and Lviv had finally been united with the Ukrainian motherland was nothing more than an obvious pretext to justify the illegal carving up of the Second Polish Republic. Polish state symbols were removed, and singing the Catholic hymn Boże coś Polskie was forbidden due to its subversive undertones. The Wały Hetmańskie in the west of the city was renamed to Boulevard of the Soviets. The Soviet rulers also planned to erect a monument for Vladimir Lenin in front of the Opera House, but only the pedestal could be finished before the German invasion. Still, monuments to famous Poles like Adam Mickiewicz were treated respectfully, and the Soviet propaganda was not targeting Polish culture in itself, but rather the dominance of the Polish landowners and factory owners. While some might have initially welcomed the Soviets, they would quickly become disillusioned as the USSR under Joseph Stalin quickly introduced a brutal regime of terror. The head of the Ukrainian NKVD, Ivan Cyril, ordered his men to look for Polish, Ukrainian and other counter-revolutionaries who threatened Soviet rule. Mere weeks after the Soviet takeover, the NKVD arrested and imprisoned hundreds of individuals in Lviv, including the mayor, civil servants, politicians and intellectuals. In one night alone, 226 Polish officers were arrested. As you can imagine, the city's prisons were constantly crowded. Daily life in the city became marked by fear and paranoia, as people feared that the NKVD would target them next. This rule of terror only further divided Lviv's inhabitants along lines of nationality, as people began to denounce members of the other ethnic groups. Things got a lot worse in 1940 when a wave of mass deportations hit the city. The first deportation occurred in February, and it mostly targeted Polish settlers in East Galicia, as well as landowners who were seen as the most fanatic enemies of the Ukrainian population. In total, around 95,000 people were deported from western Ukraine, including 142 families from Lviv. They were locked in cattle cars and transported to inhospitable and desolate areas in northeastern Russia, where they were then forced to work under horrible conditions. Many of the deportees would not survive the ordeal. The second wave of deportation took place in April, and it aimed to rid the newly annexed territories of so-called unreliable subjects. In March, 6 members of the Soviet Politburo, including Joseph Stalin, Mikhail Kalinin and Vyacheslav Molotov, ordered the mass execution of nearly 22,000 Polish prisoners of war, a war crime which is known as the Katyn Massacre. Nikita Khrushchev, who was then the head of the Communist Party in Ukraine, proposed to deport the relatives of the victims. In an effort to make sure that an independent Polish state can never exist again, all the remaining representatives of the Second Polish Republic were also sent eastward. In total, around 7,200 people from Lviv were deported, 90% of whom were Poles. In June of 1940, the third and the largest deportation took place, which targeted refugees from German-occupied Poland. In the preceding months, all the refugees from Lviv had been identified by a German committee, and between February and March, roughly 66,000 refugees decided to head back home to the general government. In spring, the decision was made to deport all the refugees that still remained in the Soviet occupation zone. And so 22,000 people were deported from Lviv alone, most of whom were Jews. What made this deportation stand out from all the others, apart from its scale, was the fact that it became a public spectacle in which the victims were publicly rounded up and then herded through the streets. The final deportation took place almost 1 year later, in May 1941, and it mostly targeted ethnic Ukrainians. Hundreds of people from Lviv were affected. A fifth deportation to combat counter-revolutionary, anti-Soviet and socially alien elements was planned in June, but couldn't be implemented due to the German invasion. The vast majority of the victims of Soviet repression were innocent. They were only targeted because they either belonged to the pre-war political and social elite, were considered untrustworthy aliens, or because of their political stance. All of Lviv's ethnic groups felt the impact of the terror, but it was particularly severe for the Poles and the Jews. This was because of the fact that Poles and Jews made up the bulk of Eastern Galicia's high social classes. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, were mostly targeted when they opposed collectivization or when they supported Ukrainian nationalist organizations. As is often the case in oppressive regimes, the various groups did not develop a feeling of solidarity against a common enemy, but rather competed as victims and accused each other of collaboration or of profiting from Soviet rule. As Ukrainians began to replace Poles in higher positions, the rivalry between the two grew. Many Poles fell for the Soviet pretext of re-Ukrainizing Eastern Galicia and saw the Ukrainians as willing collaborators. When Soviet repression hit the Ukrainians, many of them accused the Poles of intrigue and of working with the enemy. Just like in World War I during the Austrian military regime, the ethnic groups blamed each other for their misery. The only thing that united the Poles and the Ukrainians was their growing hatred for the Jews. Initially, many Jews had indeed welcomed the Soviets and were more than willing to work with them. The reason for this is quite simple. Many Jews saw the USSR as the only alternative to Nazi Germany, and they approved of the Soviet stance against anti-Semitism and their promise to grant them equal rights, something which the Second Republic of Poland failed to do. This still didn't prevent the Jews from being disproportionately affected by Stalinist terror. But Polish and Ukrainian nationalists refused to recognize this, and they only saw the Jews as collaborators. The old anti-Semitic stereotype of communism being a Jewish conspiracy to destroy the old world order resurfaced. This is, of course, nonsense, and most Jews in Lviv only supported the Soviets out of fear. As the Polish Jew Stanisław Różycki put it, only the Jews do not waver, regardless of their feelings or their rational and moderate attitudes towards the Union, although they suffered. Although their possessions were seized, their families were deported, nevertheless they counted solely on Russia, because everything is better than the Germans. It simply didn't matter to Polish or Ukrainian nationalists, and they kept stubbornly linking Judaism with the Soviet Union. One Polish eyewitness described how it was a sad paradox that the only bridge of communication between Poles and Ukrainians was their hatred of Jews. Under Soviet rule, these animosities were mostly kept under control, but the tensions that had been building up over the years were unleashed in the most violent manner when the Germans unexpectedly invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. As the Wehrmacht advanced on Lviv, the NKVD began to execute a big portion of the prisoners that were still held in the Brygitki and Łącki prisons. Most of them were ethnic Ukrainians, and they had been imprisoned for political reasons or because they were considered to be dangerous criminals. Jews and Poles were also among the victims. It is difficult to estimate just how many people have been killed, but a recent estimate puts the number between 3,100 and 3,500. The first German soldiers arrived in Lviv on the 30th of June 1941, and the reactions were mixed. The Ukrainians especially considered the Germans to be liberators from Soviet terror, and are reported to have welcomed them with flowers and laughter. The Poles, on the other hand, were much more reserved, while the Jews hurried into their homes. For many Ukrainian nationalists, this was the chance to finally establish an independent Ukrainian state. The most prominent and simultaneously the most radical and violent Ukrainian movement at the time was the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or OUN for short. It had been founded in 1929 to destabilize the Polish Republic with terrorist activities, with the final aim being the creation of a Ukrainian state. The OUN quickly adopted a radical fascist nationalist ideology. Just before the outbreak of World War II, Andriy Melnik took over leadership of the OUN. However, many members believed that Melnik was too cautious and too restrained, and so the younger, more radical wing split off in 1940. From that point on, there were two rival factions: the OUN-M, still led by Andriy Melnik, and the OUN-B, led by the charismatic and much more radical Stepan Bandera. In the early 1940s, the OUN developed into a full-on fascist movement which sought to establish an authoritarian, poorly Ukrainian state in which the OUN ruled unconditionally. Inspired by National Socialism in Germany, the OUN-B adopted certain characteristic symbols. During the Second General Congress of the OUN in Krakow in 1941, Bandera was declared to be the providnik, the leader of the Ukrainian nation. Furthermore, they began to employ the fascist salute of raising the right arm and to greet each other with the phrases Slava Ukraini and Heroyam Slava. The red and black flag was introduced as the official emblem of the OUN-B, symbolizing the blood and soil ideology. On the 30th of June 1941, the very day the German army arrived in Lviv, the OUN proclaimed Ukrainian statehood during a small meeting in the Lubomirsky Palace. Because Bandera couldn't attend the meeting in person, the Ukrainian state was instead proclaimed by his representative, Yaroslav Stetsko. In the declaration, Stetsko clearly stated that he and his organization would closely cooperate with Nazi Germany, that under the leadership of Adolf Hitler is creating a new order in Europe and the world and helping the Ukrainian nation liberate itself from Muscovite occupation. The new government that he formed was called the State Administration of Ukraine, and its members either belonged to the OUN or were at least very loyal to it. Its existence was short-lived, but during the government sessions the members expressed their goal of creating an ethnically pure Ukrainian state, and that all non-Ukrainians living in these territories should either be evacuated or annihilated. Mere hours after the proclamation, a series of pogroms broke out in East Galicia, the most well-known example of which is the Lviv Pogrom of 1941. The direct cause for the outbreak of the pogrom was the harrowing discovery of the decomposing corpses of the prisoners that had been shot by the NKVD in the days prior to the Soviet evacuation. On the 30th of June 1941, the Germans ordered the Jews to retrieve the bodies and to put them on public display. Already on that day, the local population began to let out their anger at their Jewish neighbours, whom they blamed for the deaths of their relatives because of the alleged Jewish collaboration with the Soviets. On the next day, July 1st, the violence erupted into a full-on pogrom. The Jews in the city were forced to carry out humiliating tasks. For example, Jewish men and women were forced to clean the streets on their hands and knees, oftentimes with nothing but toothbrushes, while they were laughed at and berated. Jewish women in particular became the victims of brutal mob violence. They were beaten, shoved, spat on, tossed around, stripped naked, and chased through the streets by Ukrainian and Polish civilians. Pregnant women were kicked in the stomach, and rapes were also reported. A German camera team was present to film the abuse. I'm not going to show it here, but you can find a digital copy of the film on the website of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The Germans also took a number of pictures, and this one here in particular has burned itself into my memory. You can absolutely see the sheer terror in that poor woman's face as she desperately tries to run away from her abusers, one of them being a young boy with a stick. She never did anything to them. Her only crime was being Jewish. It is absolutely impossible to imagine the sheer horror she must have gone through before and after this picture was taken. On that day, Ukrainian militiamen went from house to house in the Jewish neighborhoods and arrested Jewish civilians to escort them to the prisons, where they were then forced to exhume the bodies. On the way there, they were beaten up with sticks, thrown out with stones, and insulted by local civilians. During the pogrom, the Ukrainian militia played the lead role. It had been established just before the arrival of German troops at the orders of Stetsko and consisted of Ukrainian volunteers, most of them OUN activists. Even though the OUN didn't necessarily consider Jews to be the biggest threat to the Ukrainian nation, that honor belonged to the Russians and the Poles, the Ukrainian nationalist movement still harbored deeply anti-Semitic tendencies. Furthermore, the OUN probably carried out the pogrom in an attempt to demonstrate to the Germans that they had something in common and that they were a trustworthy ally. The crowd that tormented their Jewish neighbours was of mixed nationality. Both Poles and Ukrainians were reported to have been among them. They appeared to have been taken over by an uncontrollable bloodlust and a desire for revenge. Many inhabitants of the city associated Jews with Soviet terror and saw the sudden social advancement of the Jews under the USSR as a big injustice that needed to be rectified. In their eyes, the Jews needed to be put back into their place, which is why many of them were publicly humiliated on such a large scale. The roughly 1,000 Jews who were taken to the prisons by the Ukrainian militia were then forced to exhume the bodies of the NKVD victims. Afterwards, many of them were beaten up and shot by German Einsatzgruppen. The pogrom lasted several days until the German city commander ordered a stop to it. While German units were not directly involved in the bestial violence of the pogrom itself, they tolerated it and let it happen. With the public display of the NKVD bodies and the hanging up of posters which called for revenge against the Jewish Bolshevists, the Germans purposefully provoked the mob violence, with much success. Adolf Volkmann, a Polish Jew from Lviv who managed to survive the Holocaust, would later write, "The campaign had fulfilled its real purpose. A large part of the city's Polish and Ukrainian population had looted Jewish flats and stolen Jewish valuables. Now they had all become accomplices of the Germans against the Jews." There can be no doubt that the units of the Einsatzgruppe C and their commander Otto Rasch were the masterminds behind the pogrom. Just a few days prior, the chief of the Reich Security Main Office, Reinhard Heydrich, gave an order to the commanders of the Einsatzgruppen to instigate pogroms against Jews in the occupied areas of the Soviet Union. In the days following the pogrom, Einsatzkommandos 5 and 6, with the help of the Ukrainian militia, arrested around 3,000 Jews, drove them to a sand pitch outside of town, and shot them in cold blood. Over the course of July, members of the Gestapo and the Sicherheitspolizei targeted Jewish people in the city and either executed them as well or sent them to a labor camp. Towards the end of the month, another public pogrom broke out in Lviv following the assassination of the former president of the short-lived Ukrainian People's Republic, Simon Petliura, in Paris by a Jewish anarchist. An angry Ukrainian mob swept through Lviv, attacked Jewish people on sight, and plundered their homes. Members of the Jewish intelligentsia were taken out of their homes by the militia, taken to a military prison, and murdered. Several thousand Jews lost their lives to the pogroms and the Einsatzgruppen killings there. But not only the Jews suffered in this first week of Nazi occupation, the Polish intelligentsia did as well. Even before 1941, the German rulers followed a brutal policy of repressing Polish scholars. The most famous example of this was Sonderaktion Krakau in November 1939. The leader of the SS Einsatzkommando II, Bruno Müller, set up a trap and announced that he would hold a lecture at the Jagiellonian University in Kraków. After the local academics had gathered, Müller announced that the Jagiellonian University had always been a centre of anti-German activity and that it would therefore be shut down. All the present academics were swiftly arrested and then taken to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. 6 of them died shortly after arriving, and 3 Jewish professors were murdered. After strong and fierce international outrage and criticism, even from Benito Mussolini himself, the remaining professors were set free. After this, the general governor, Hans Frank, told a group of police officers, "The Kraków professors were a terrible headache to deal with. Had we dealt with the issue then and there, it would have looked differently." What he meant by that became very clear in July 1941. The professors and scholars who had turned Lviv into such a reputable and sophisticated place of learning during the interwar period were to be swiftly executed. A special unit consisting of Gestapo and SS members under the command of Eberhard Schöngard went around town and arrested about 24 professors alongside a number of household members. They were taken to a hill outside of the city, shot and then thrown into a mass grave. On that day, around 37 people lost their lives. Over the course of the following month, another 10 academics would be killed. The hopes of many Ukrainian nationalists that they could form a Ukrainian state under German patronage quickly turned out to be wishful thinking. An autonomous Ukraine had no place in Nazi Germany's post-war plans of creating a colonial living space for ethnic Germans in Eastern Europe. And so leading Banderites were arrested shortly after the proclamation, including Stepan Bandera and Jaroslav Stetsko themselves, and then sent to German prisons and concentration camps. Afterwards, the Germans showed some willingness to work with more moderate layers of Ukrainian society. On the 30th of July 1941, the Ukrainian National Council was established in Lviv under the leadership of the Greek Catholic Archbishop Andrei Sheptytsky and the politician Kost Levitsky, who had been the leader of the largest Ukrainian party in the Second Polish Republic. The council was responsible for the Ukrainians in the district of Galicia, which had been annexed into the general government in August 1941. After Szeptycki had protested against the extermination of the Jews, the council was disbanded in March 1942. From that point on, Ukrainians in the general government were represented by the Ukrainian Central Committee in Kraków. After 1943, many young Ukrainians also began to fight alongside the German army as part of the SS Galicia Division. However, both the Galicia Division and the Ukrainian Central Committee were nothing but a shallow facade that kept up the illusion that Ukrainians had any say or control. In reality, the general government was part of the Greater German Reich, and power rested primarily with Hans Frank. Even though the Nazis refrained from committing any more major acts of violence against the Polish or Ukrainian population in Lviv, daily life in the city became increasingly difficult. Whereas the Soviets had considered Lviv an integral part of their territory and therefore supplied it with food and goods, the Germans instead recklessly exploited the area for the war effort. As a result, hunger and misery became a part of everyday life, which led to a further increase in ethnic tensions. As the contemporary witness Tadeusz Tomaszewski wrote in his diary, "The oppressed nations trust the oppressor more than their fellow oppressed. At the very least, this applies to mixed territories like ours, in which many old conflicts exist." Many Poles began to blame the Ukrainians for the Soviet deportations and accused them of complicity in the murder of the Lviv professors. Furthermore, the strong presence of the OUN was understandably frightening, and the oftentimes rough behaviour of the local Ukrainian auxiliary police only further aggravated the Poles. Around 1943, it became clear to many that Germany could not win this war, and the fear that the Soviets might return brought along the desire for rapprochement between the two. Talks were held between the OUNB and the Home Army, the largest Polish resistance group, but they ultimately bore no fruits. Neither side was willing to give up its claim on Lviv, and both sides expected that Poles and Ukrainians would once again be fighting for control over the city, just like in 1918. Mutual dislike and mistrust turned into uncompromising hatred when news of the massacres of Poles in Volhynia and eastern Galicia began to spread. In spring of 1943, members of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the partisan formation founded by the OUN, began to systematically slaughter Polish civilians in the countryside in order to ethnically cleanse the area. The Polish Home Army retaliated by attacking Ukrainian villages. Lviv itself was spared from these atrocities, largely because of the Polish majority population and because of the strong presence of the Home Army. The Poles in Lviv were counting on a quick Allied victory and prepared themselves for the armed struggle that would inevitably happen after Germany's defeat. They organised countless patriotic proclamations in the streets, on the trams and on the market. On the 1st of November 1943, they decorated the graves in the military cemetery with candles and Polish flags to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Battle of Lwów. They printed and spread pamphlets bearing the title Leopolis Semper Fidelis, the official motto of the city, and a very clear declaration of loyalty to the Polish state. The Volhynian Galician slaughter made any sort of reconciliation impossible. Even before 1943, many Poles in East Galicia began to call for the expulsion of all ethnic Ukrainians over the river Spruch. In July 1942, the staff of the Home Army in Lviv recommended deporting up to 1.5 million Ukrainians to Soviet Ukraine, so that the eastern areas of Poland would finally have a Polish majority. After the brutal conflict broke out, the determination to finally drive out the Ukrainians grew and became a consensus among Lviv's Poles. After the arrival of the Soviet army, a population transfer indeed took place, but not in the way that the local Poles had imagined it. But before we talk about that, we need to discuss the fate of the Jews that still remained in Lviv after the pogrom. Initially, the Germans followed a policy of excluding the Jews from everyday life, discriminating against them and economically exploiting them as a cheap workforce. From 1941 onward, Jews above the age of 12 were forced to wear an armband with a blue Star of David, so that they can be identified immediately. SS commandos began to systematically destroy Lviv's Jewish cultural heritage. They burned down the synagogues in the city, including the Golden Rose and Reformed synagogues. They desecrated the Jewish graveyards and used the gravestones to pave the paths inside the newly built Janowska concentration camp just outside of Lviv. In autumn, all of the city's 140,000 Jews were relocated to the dilapidated Kleparów and Samarystów quarters in the northwest of the city, where everyone got allocated approximately 2 square meters of living space. On the way there, they had to pass a checkpoint staffed by SS goons and Ukrainian militiamen. They abused the Jews, arbitrarily confiscated what little possessions they still had, and violently separated thousands of women, children, and disabled people from the others. Those were executed shortly after. In the ghetto, a short period of deceiving normality ensued in which the Jews tried to adapt to their new living conditions. Adolf Volkmann writes, "We hoped that the months of chaos would end in the foreseeable future, and the days of a new, albeit limited, rule of law would begin. But we had no idea that our physical destruction was being planned, because no normal person in their right mind could imagine such a thing." The Lviv Jewish Council attempted to make life more bearable for everybody by distributing flats and food. But still, living conditions were absolutely terrible in the new Jewish quarter. Food was constantly scarce, and due to the overcrowdedness, diseases like typhus spread quickly. On the 20th of September 1941, a new decree forced all Jews between the ages of 14 and 60 to provide proof of employment. All Jews in Lviv who were capable of working were systematically registered, and in the following months a valid certificate of employment became crucial for survival. Those who were found without it could be arrested and sent to a concentration camp. While working at one of the several arms manufacturing companies or any of the other factories that were considered vital to the war effort provided a certain form of protection from the SS, life still continued to be dreadful. The Jews were ruthlessly exploited and subjected to a harsh and brutal terror regime. Some companies simply didn't pay their Jewish workers, and oftentimes they even sold positions for a high price. Adolf Volkmann writes, "It was a natural advantage for our bosses, who at the time only employed Jews so that they never had to pay wages to their workers. No Jew worked for Lindenberger, Kremin and Wolf to earn a living. They worked at the waste collection centers in order to keep their lives." This situation was not to last long. In the preceding months, the SS and police leader of Lublin, Odilo Globocnik, supervised the construction of an extermination camp at Bełżec. As soon as it was finished, the systematic deportation and extermination of Lviv's Jews could begin. The local SS and police leader of Galicia, Fritz Katzmann, was responsible for planning the operation. The Jewish Council in Lviv was informed that around 30,000 unemployed, homeless or so-called asocial Jews were to be resettled to a labor camp. To keep up the illusion, the deportees were allowed to take a small amount of cash and some luggage with them. With the help of the Ukrainian auxiliary police, the Jewish ghetto police arbitrarily and brutally arrested Jews on the streets and then sent them to a school building, where they were allegedly checked for their ability to work. Afterwards, they were taken to the Kleparów train station, loaded onto a railway car, and sent off to Bełżec. Between the 16th of March and the 1st of April 1942, 15,000 Jews were deported to Bełżec in total. Very soon afterwards, the remaining Jews began to suspect the worst. The fact that many deportees had to leave their luggage at Kleparów train station already, and that they were mostly old people, made it very unlikely that they were sent to a camp for work. The number of Jews in Lviv was to be incrementally reduced. Those who were unable to work or otherwise deemed unworthy of life were immediately executed, while everybody else would continue to be exploited. In June 1942, members of the SS conducted a raid in the ghetto, searched the homes and arrested between 6,000 and 8,000 people, who allegedly had no proof of employment. They were taken to the Janowska concentration camp and killed. In July, the Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler ordered that the deportation of all Jews unfit for work should be finished by the end of the year. And so, a new wave of deportations from Lviv was organized in August, once again by Fritz Katzmann. Men from the SS, Gestapo, police and Ukrainian militia searched the ghetto, and this time they were much more brutal in their conduct. Volkmann writes, "Thousands upon thousands of Jews were dragged out of their homes. Nobody was allowed to take anything with them. The SS men cynically and rudely explained that nothing more was needed in this life. The SS men rummaged through the beds and searched for valuables. They took everything they could. They tapped the walls for hiding places. The Jews who were stopped were herded through the streets in groups and subjected to constant abuse. Anyone who fell over was shot on the spot. Bodies lay in heaps of 10 or 20 in all the streets of the Jewish quarter. Hundreds of men and women, even children, threw themselves out of the windows. They chose voluntary death rather than put themselves in the hands of the SS. In total, around 50,000 Jews were rounded up and taken to Janowska camp. There, the SS arbitrarily examined the victims for their ability to work. Most didn't pass. An unknown number of people was shot on the spot, and the rest were sent to Belzec. The remaining 50,000 Jews in the city endured an inhumane existence in the now fenced-in ghetto. Most of them constantly suffered from hunger and disease. Due to the horrible sanitary conditions and the lack of medical care, typhus, tuberculosis and scurvy became widespread. Everyone who couldn't get hold of a job was swiftly killed. This was the fate of another 20,000 people in November and January. A look at the amount of ration cards issued by the Jewish Council over the course of the months shows just how ruthlessly and quickly the mass murder was carried out. The final destruction of Lviv's Jews took place in June 1943, when SS men and their helpers entered the ghetto to either kill the remaining Jews then and there, or take them to Janowska. Some Jews attempted to put up armed resistance with guns and hand grenades they had bought from Italian and Hungarian soldiers in the preceding months. They fought bravely, but were only able to delay the inevitable by 3 days. Many buildings in the ghetto were then set on fire to drive out everybody who was still in hiding. After this murder campaign, Katzmann declared the district of Galicia to be Judenfrei, free of Jews. The roughly 8,000 survivors were taken to Janowska and forced to keep working in the arms industry. In November 1943, Janowska was liquidated and everyone who remained was shot. To hide the proof of their crimes, the SS forced 120 Jewish workers to open up the mass graves around Lviv, burn the bodies and to crush the bones in a special machine. When the Soviets took over the city, only a few hundred Jews had managed to hide and survive. The multiple centuries old Jewish community that had defined and shaped Lviv for ages was wiped out forever within just a couple of years. How did the Ukrainians and the Poles of Lviv react to the murder of the Jews? To put it shortly, it was ambivalent. During the relocation of the city's Jews to the ghetto, many inhabitants helped the Germans in finding Jews who were hiding. According to eyewitnesses, the Ukrainians in particular were very quick to plunder the now abandoned flats or to simply take over the house. Ukrainian partisan troops also frequently murdered Jews who had managed to flee into the woods. Still, many Ukrainian civilians did not share this rabid anti-Semitism and instead helped the Jews. In total, a little over 100 death sentences were passed against Ukrainians who aided the Jews. The most well-known example of a Ukrainian dissident was Archbishop Andrei Sheptytsky, who selflessly hid hundreds of Jews in his own residence or his monasteries. Prevailing National Democrat stereotypes from the interwar era and Nazi propaganda had a lasting effect on Lviv's Poles who, even during the evident mass murder, still saw the Jews as their greatest internal enemy. They may not have supported the brutal extermination of the Jews, and oftentimes held deep sympathies for their individual victims, but as a whole what happened to the Jews was seen as just. A report written by the Lviv Home Army in autumn 1942 demonstrates this very well. The Aryan population witnessed this action with pain, even if in the relationships to Jews a strong aversion had developed after the Bolshevik invasion. Nevertheless, when their own eyes saw what was done to Jews, it made a pitiable impression on them. All condemn the bestiality and the premeditation with which the Jews are being murdered, but generally it is said that the Jews are getting the punishment of history. Despite this, many Poles risked their lives to save the Jews, and the small number of Lviv's Jews who managed to survive the Holocaust could only do so due to the help of their brave Polish and Ukrainian neighbours. On the 26th of July 1944, the Red Army returned to Lviv, and for the Polish inhabitants, this was not a good sign. Already during the Tehran Conference in 1943, the Allies had agreed to grant the Soviet Union sovereignty over all the areas it had taken from Poland in 1939. The new Polish state was to be compensated with Germany's eastern territories. Furthermore, the Allies agreed that Europe could only see lasting peace if its states were of a mono-ethnic nature. To summarize, Ukrainian nationalists, Stalin and the Western Allies all agreed that the Poles in Lviv would have to go. Many Poles feared further deportations to Siberia much more than an expulsion to the west, and for good reason. Immediately after the Soviet takeover, the NKVD arrested and deported thousands of ethnic Poles on the pretext that they had collaborated with the Germans. During this time, the Ukrainian insurgent army continued its massacres of Poles in the Galician and Volhynian countryside, and because of the fact that the Home Army had been disbanded, there was no longer any form of defense. In September 1944, the evacuation treaties were signed in Lublin by the Communist Polish Committee of National Liberation and the various Soviet republics east of Poland, which determined that the Polish and Jewish populations living in eastern Poland would be repatriated to the new Polish state. Out of fear from Ukrainian nationalists and Soviet deportations, many Poles in Lviv registered for transport, while still holding on to the hope that they may be allowed to remain after all. Most people still remained attached to their hometown and didn't want to leave this city, which had such an important role to play in Polish history. Furthermore, the new home which was designated for them was Breslau, or Wrocław, a city which was 2/3 destroyed and in no way suitable for living. All hope vanished in 1945. The Allies definitively put all the German territories east of the Oder-Neisse rivers under Polish control, and the new Polish government signed a border treaty with the Soviet Union, renouncing all its claims on eastern Poland. In autumn of 1945, up to 17,000 Poles were transported from Lviv to the west each month, and by the end of the year, 3/4 of the Polish population had left. The Soviets made life for the remaining Poles miserable by confiscating their homes, threatening them with deportation, and denying them ration cards. By the summer of 1946, all of the city's Poles, with the exception of a small number of people in mixed marriages or key positions, were gone. With the loss of both its Jewish and Polish populations at the hands of the Germans and the Soviets, Lviv lost its multi-ethnic character forever. The Poles left the city out of fear and external pressure, and not at all voluntarily. Some parts of Polish Lviv were recreated in Wrocław as the exilees put the local university back into operation, set up the Ossolineum, and founded the University of Science and Technology in their new hometown. Only a small fraction of Lviv's pre-war population had remained. They were quickly joined by Ukrainians from the countryside and Russians from other parts of the Soviet Union. The first census after World War II was taken in 1959, and it registered a bit more than 410,000 people. 60% were Ukrainian, 27% Russian, 4% Jews, and 4% Poles. The urban fabric of Lviv may have survived the war for the most part, but its old character was irreversibly destroyed. Today, the city is clearly Central European. It has kept the architectural heritage of its Polish and Austrian times, and its old town was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Still, the brutal past of the city weighs heavily on its inhabitants. The long and rich Polish past is only rarely talked about, and so is the Jewish heritage. Lutz Kleverman, a journalist who wrote a pop history examination of Lviv in 2017, summarized it like this. There are 3 collective memories in Lviv that have very little in common with each other. Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews remember the city very differently, due to their often contradictory experiences. With the exception of the Jews, each ethnic group was sometimes at the top and sometimes at the bottom, victim and perpetrator at the same time. Another bone of contention is the matter of Ukrainian collaboration with Nazi Germany. Ukrainian nationalists played a huge role in carrying out the Holocaust in the city, and the massacre of ethnic Poles still affects Polish-Ukrainian relationships. The fact that Stepan Bandera is oftentimes celebrated as a national hero and freedom fighter is currently taking its toll in the war against Russia, which is shamelessly exploiting this fact for propaganda purposes. Now that Ukraine is under attack by its bully neighbour who refuses to recognize Ukrainian identity, a sincere and critical examination and dealing with the past is more important than ever before. But as long as old wounds remain and nationalistic narratives dominate the discourse, that won't happen so soon. Dankeschön for watching until the end. As you probably know, making these videos is extremely time consuming, so if you want to make absolutely sure that I make more of them, please consider supporting me on Patreon. In exchange, you'll get access to a Patreon exclusive Discord server and, depending on your tier level, a number of other benefits. So I'm absolutely grateful for my invaluable supporters: Marius Gerling, Ian York, A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Philipp Marchewka, the Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drole, Wienweh, Sudorizer, Lyle Furphy, Yin, William, Big Dave, Folling, and Turd Ham Bone. Have a very nice day, and see you next time.